First things first, welcome to the new studio. Hope you like what we've done with the place. Do feel free to have a look around. Just please try not to snicker when you notice that there's a desk in the supply closet, because that's actually Jim Eagle's office and he's really sensitive about it. But wait, did I call it a supply closet? No, it's a private corner office where we just happen to keep the cleaning supplies and the toilet paper. But more importantly, it was quite a red letter day yesterday, no pun intended, for at long last, 3 goddamn years later, the U.S. government has grudgingly admitted through firmly gritted teeth with a gun to their head that, yeah, okay, the great communist Chinese Wuhan Kung Flu coronavirus of 2019 actually probably almost certainly did originate at the Wuhan Tony Fauci Memorial Institute of Virology, and not from some poor bastard who had a hankering for a bowl of fruit bat soup directly across the road from the Wuhan Tony Fauci Memorial Institute of Virology. But I think in uncertain times like these, it's reassuring to remind ourselves that there's only about a 36-month lag time between the basic common sense of the average man on the street and the considered professional opinions of the U.S. government and the public health community and the people who used to call themselves the press, but who are now just pitiful, pathetic, obedient transcriptionists for the very same people they are supposed to be holding to account on behalf of the citizenry. But hey, it's cool. We can do that job ourselves, and we are. So the performance artists, they can go get fucked for all I care. Because what do I need them for, exactly? All they really do is provide 17 layers of bullshit and obfuscation that you have to cut through with a knife before you get to whatever tiny little nugget of truth is buried underneath it. And if it sounds like I have nothing but utter contempt for our fourth estate, good, because I do. If they have earned anything, it is utter contempt. And you know what I did recently? As a sort of masochistic thought experiment, I watched one entire night of the primetime lineup on MSNBC. And you know what I learned? I learned that MSNBC stands for Mustn't Slander Nobody But Crackers. This is an entire cable news channel that is built around race hate, where every program is a panel discussion with 3 or 4 professional race huckster lunatics trying to outdo each other with their descriptions of how awful white people are. And I actually felt dirty watching it, like physically unclean. This was 3 hours of pure 90-proof race hate that I sat and watched. I don't think I would have felt any different if I had sat through a Klan meeting. But there's one other thing they talk about on primetime MSNBC, aside from how bad and evil white people are, and it's how racist Fox News is. Because I guess self-awareness truly is dead. 7 years ago, Tucker Carlson was the goofy milquetoast fence-sitter guy with the bow tie on CNN. Today, some of his own former colleagues talk about that guy like he's the bastard gay love child of David Duke and George Lincoln Rockwell. And speaking of bastard gay love children, Jim Eagle's going to hit the music for you right now. What, are you still sulking about the Office thing? Please get over it. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I refuse to change the wording of my salutation just because I have changed the premiere time. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. There was a surprisingly favorable reaction to Friday's video about the Baltimore Bonapartes. I even had a few people tell me they would love to hear more of the story, provided there is more to tell, which it turns out there very much is. Quite a bit of stuff, actually. Certainly more than enough to get us through a second chapter in the series, so I think that's what we're going to do. Besides, I have already talked about current events in the open, and that's just about as much as I feel like talking about current events at the moment. And furthermore, any episode that contains 0 mentions of bumbling cadaverous presidents and bumbling incompetent cabinet secretaries, well, that's a worthwhile episode, in my view. So let's quickly recap where we left off a few nights ago. Jerome Bonaparte has nearly started a war with England. Then he flees to live in hiding in New Orleans, then makes his way to Baltimore and enters into an intimate acquaintance with Miss Elizabeth Patterson, Glorious Betsy to her friends, which quickly produces an unintended pregnancy and a shotgun wedding courtesy of Mr. Patterson. Jerome and Betsy then set sail for Europe, where they part for the last time ever on the shores of Portugal, never to see each other again, if Napoleon has anything to say about it, which it turns out he does. Jerome and Betsy's marriage is nullified by imperial decree. She makes her way home to Baltimore after giving birth in England, and he goes to Paris to try on his brand new general's uniform and his brand new admiral's uniform while he waits around to find out which European princess he is going to be ordered to marry. And he didn't have to wait around all that long to find out. In fact, Napoleon already had his second marriage negotiated before he had even annulled the first one. The other party in these negotiations, it turns out, was Frederick I, King of Württemberg. Actually, no, he's not. He's not the king yet. He's still Prince of Württemberg. But part of Napoleon's proposal says, look, you marry your daughter to my brother, and I will make them king and queen of Westphalia, which I am going to dream into existence out of the German territories that I have recently conquered. Also, I'm going to give you my assurance that I will leave you alone, not try to conquer your cute little realm, and furthermore, just so there's no hard feelings over your son-in-law being a king while you're only a prince, I am also going to raise Württemberg from a principality to a kingdom, and you, consequently, from a prince to a king, and your daughter from a duchess to a princess. Because what, you think I'm going to have my little brother marry a freaking duchess? Come on, man! And Frederick, he ain't no dummy. He knows a good deal when he hears one, so he says, yes, sir. I enthusiastically agree to these terms. And Jerome Bonaparte is duly betrothed to Princess Katharina of Württemberg, and their wedding present is, well, they get to be king and queen of a brand new realm that was invented by my big brother, the best man. It's a pretty kick-ass wedding gift, actually, when you get right down to it. Beats the hell out of silverware and bed sheets, am I right? We talked a little bit in the last video about how Jerome was, let's say he was a bit of a profligate and a bit of a spendthrift, to put it kindly. He was king of Westphalia for a total of 6 years, and it only took him less than 2 years to utterly bankrupt the royal treasury. This made Napoleon none too happy because his plan was for Westphalia to be a model kingdom designed to introduce the autocratic Germans to a new mode of more liberal governance, where you've still got a monarch, but there's also some form of democratic legislative institution, something perhaps a bit more forward-thinking than the absolute monarchies that the Germans had always been accustomed to up to that point. But none of it matters all that much anyway, because even if he had been a good and responsible and much-loved king, Jerome was getting his ass deposed the minute Napoleon got his ass deposed. So Napoleon loses the War of the Sixth Coalition. He gets exiled to Elba in 1813, and Jerome's kingdom of Westphalia promptly ceases to exist. But then, less than a year later, Napoleon escapes. He lands back in France, and the troops that are sent to arrest him, well, they acclaim him and join his side instead, and within less than a fortnight, he has managed to reinstall himself onto the French throne, and so begins the War of the Seventh Coalition, and the period that is known to history as the 100 Days. Since he is newly unemployed and very much available, Jerome, who is still a French general, despite having been king of a foreign nation up until recently, he is placed in command of the 6th Division 2nd Corps of the Grande Armée, where he winds up playing a prominent and fairly disastrous role in Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo. Napoleon's intent was for Jerome's 6th Division to make a feint toward the farmhouse at Hougoumont in Wellington Center and force Wellington to commit some of his reserves and thus leave himself vulnerable to being outflanked. But Jerome either didn't get the memo or didn't understand the memo, or he was just a complete and total dumbass, because he attacked with his entire division in full force, and they were repulsed with appalling casualties, never having weakened Wellington Center and never having made him commit any of his reserves. Napoleon's career is now well and truly over. He gets exiled to St. Helena, where he dies 9 years later, and the Bourbon monarchy is once again restored in France. Meanwhile, Jerome and Katharina, the erstwhile king and queen of Westphalia, they go into exile, which in this case means a big, fancy, long vacation, including a visit to Jerome's old stomping ground, the United States of America. But even with Napoleon dead, there was still one more Bonapartist restoration to go, which happened in 1848, and another one of Napoleon's nephews, first cousin to Jerome, was installed on the throne as Napoleon III. Jerome and Cathalina are duly invited back to France. He is given a cushy, high-paying government job and spends the remainder of his life as a sort of elder statesman and uncle to the nation. He winds up being the last surviving Bonaparte brother by quite a few years. He even lives long enough to be photographed before his death in 1860, and as you can see here, he was a big fan of the Julius Caesar comb-forward look, just as his big brother had been. Meanwhile, back in Baltimore in 1805, Betsy arrives home with a son and no husband. Word reaches her that her brother-in-law, the emperor, has annulled her marriage back in France, which doesn't do her much good in Maryland, so she has to appeal to the legislature to declare that she's divorced on the grounds of spousal abandonment. But that doesn't happen until 1815, a full decade after she got back to America, and though she is still only 30 years old at that point, Betsy never shows the slightest inclination to remarry. And though she never saw or spoke to her husband again, she did correspond with Napoleon and even got him to grant her a fairly generous allowance, and she was such a good money manager and a wise investor that even though that allowance, the tap got turned off when Napoleon lost power, Betsy had positioned herself by that point to be financially self-sufficient for the remainder of her life. She didn't need no man. She spent much of the rest of her very long life, she doesn't die until 1879 at the ripe old age of 94, traveling in Europe, being regarded as a sort of popular socialite and also kind of a curiosity because it's not every random American woman who gave birth to Napoleon's nephew. And speaking of him, Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte, beau to his friends, he eventually gets a bit tired of having his mother drag him around, showing him off to people like he's some sort of weird stage prop that she can use to get herself invited to all the most fashionable cocktail parties. Oh, so this is Napoleon's bastard nephew, is it? Can I touch him? Does he bite? You can't blame the kid. I think any of us would find that shit getting pretty old pretty quick, so they have a falling out over it. Beau decides, I'm sorry, Mom, I can't do this shit anymore. I need to go back to Baltimore and try to have my own life. And for the next 40 years until his death in 1870, he's either estranged from his mother outright or they are just barely tolerating one another. As mentioned on Friday, Beau gets married to Susan May Williams in November of 1829. They have only 2 kids. Sons who are born an incredible 19 years apart, only the younger of whom we talked about in the first installment of this series, Charles Joseph Bonaparte, the future Navy Secretary and Attorney General, and father of the Bureau of Investigation. But would you believe his story is significantly less interesting than the story of his older brother, Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte II? This guy is the owner of one of the most fascinating military careers in the history of soldiering, and here it comes right at you. Jerome II is born 5 November 1830 in Baltimore. Surprise. Making him, since his dad was born overseas, the first native-born American member of the Bonaparte family. He receives his appointment to West Point in 1848, the same year his first cousin, once removed, is installed on the French imperial throne, and he graduates number 11 in his class in 1852. Upon receiving his butter bar as a newly minted second lieutenant, he is sent to Texas, to the future and present site of Fort Hood, to serve with the Regiment of Mounted Riflemen, which is the precursor of today's 3rd Cavalry Regiment. And it's one of the few times in U.S. Army history when we have given an accurate name to a mounted regiment. And I'm going to digress here briefly, because this is a pet peeve. I just need to get it out. In traditional American usage, we use the word cavalry differently than every other country in the world, and it has caused centuries of needless confusion, in my view. What we Americans normally call cavalry are actually dragoons. In European usage, a cavalryman does his fighting only from the saddle, while an infantryman who ride horses for transport but dismount to do their fighting, those are dragoons. Now, let's take Custer's 7th Cavalry, just to use a particularly famous example. Those guys were trained to fight from the saddle if they had to, either with pistol or with saber, but their primary tactical doctrine, because they were dragoons and not cavalry in the European sense, was to dismount and form a skirmish line and fight with rifles, while every 5th guy held the horses of the first 4 guys. That's it. I'm done. Digression over. So Jerome II, he spends the tail end of 1852, all of 1853, and the first half of 1854 out in Texas fighting hostile Indians on the frontier. Then he gets a letter from his cousin, the French emperor, asking if he'd like to come over and join the French army, which he agrees to do, and he doesn't even get a big promotion out of it. Though he probably could have. He only goes from second lieutenant to first lieutenant. Who knows? Maybe knowing the military history of his grandfather and namesake Jerome I, he was automatically leery of the whole concept of kids in their teens and 20s holding senior officer ranks. I sure as hell would be if I was him. He's in the French army for the next 16 years, 1854 to 1870. He stays all the way through the end of the Franco-Prussian War and the fall of Paris when the Bonapartes lose power for the fourth and final time. But in between, he rises to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he sees a lot of shit. He fights in the Crimean War alongside England against Russia. He fights in the Algerian campaign against Muslim separatists. He fights in the Italian campaign against Italians. And then finally, in the ill-fated Franco-Prussian War, where he is said to have acquitted himself admirably and didn't own any of the blame for the defeat. And again, you have to wonder how much of the specter of his grandfather was always in the back of his mind, or maybe the front of his mind. Because let's face it, when your name is Jerome Bonaparte, and the previous guy named Jerome Bonaparte was basically the worst general of all time, and probably even worse as an admiral, that's got to be a hell of a powerful motivator, I would think. A negative object lesson, if you will. When the going gets tough, you fold your hands and you say, Lord, please help me not be like Grandpa. Now, before leaving Europe and returning home to Baltimore, Jerome II was personally decorated for valor by both the Sultan of Turkey and the Queen of England, and obviously the portion of his life that he spent fighting in Europe partially coincided with the Civil War back home in America, so he was probably the only professional American soldier who wound up sitting out the war between the states. Sorry, I mean the War of Northern Aggression. Don't yell at me, Confederate viewers. So Jerome II is 40 years old by the time he gets home from his European adventures. And he marries yet another in our series of Baltimore heiress socialites and manages to sire a couple of daughters who were born when he is 43 and 48 respectively. And my God, that's the age I am now. And still siring children? Oh, God! And here's the fun caveat to the end of the story of Jerome II. If his family hadn't been deposed in 1870, even though he was from the American branch of the family that we prefer not to talk about, when Napoleon III died in 1873, Jerome II would have had by far the strongest claim to the throne. And wouldn't that have been quite the life trajectory, all the way from second lieutenant in the U.S. Army to Emperor of the French? But I guess Napoleon got there all the way from corporal, so he still wins. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this 2-episode deep dive into the life and times of the Baltimore Bonapartes. I know I sure have. But I guess we can't do historical deep dives forever. At some point we have to get back to talking about the semi-animated cadaver who must not be named. So until then, thanks very much indeed for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow. I see you bright and early Thursday morning. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.